Everyone, thank you for coming today. I would like to share a project with you this evening titled The Correlation of Preparedness Surveys with Performance Tests in High School Physical Education. My name is Nicholas Cullen Carroll, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Concordia, St. Paul. So a little background information to start us off. Secondary education involves K through 12 education, predominantly the 9th through 12th grade individual, which spans the age from 13 to 19. And usually this includes every number of subjects from mathematics to science to English, and then of course physical education is one of those topics. This is a fundamental topic that teaches physical literacy in this age group. There's a couple different sets of standards for teachers to be able to teach this subject by. One is produced by Shape America, which is the national or federal standards. This is produced from a piece of literature in 2013 by Shape America themselves. And there's a couple different articles that teachers have to abide by, including physical literate individuals are going to demonstrate competency in a variety of motor skills and movement patterns. Physical literate individuals are going to apply knowledge of concepts, principles, strategies, and tactics related to movement and performance. Physical literate individuals demonstrate knowledge and skills to achieve and maintain a health-enhancing level of physical activity and fitness. Physical literate individuals exhibit responsible personal and social behavior that respects self and others. And physical literate individuals recognize that value of physical activity for health, enjoyment, challenge, self-expression, and/or social interaction. So this project is going to be taking place in Southern California, which means we also have to abide by a different set of standards, which are proposed as the Physical Education Model Content Standards for California. Those were last produced in the early 2000s, and they have yet to be amended. So those are only going to be 3 as opposed to the 5 proposed by that federal body Shape. And those 3 California standards are that students demonstrate knowledge of and competency in motor skills, movement patterns, and strategies needed to perform a variety of physical activities. Students achieve a level of physical activity for health and performance while demonstrating knowledge of fitness concepts, principles, strategies. And then the final standard is that students will demonstrate a knowledge of psychological and sociological concepts, principles, and strategies that apply to the learning and performance of physical activity. If you're listening closely and you could hear all those standards, you're probably understanding that if we're talking about surveys, we're focusing on that final standard, which does focus on the psychological and sociological concepts associated with physical activity. So there's a couple studies that I want to bring up before we get into the lit review. There was a past study by Hooper et al., and sifting through most of my literature review, a lot of the studies citing the use of wellness, preparedness, or ready-to-train scales reference the Hooper article from 1995, which gives us a fundamental grounding for why the psychological concepts are supposed to be integrated to athletic performance, and why we need to understand some of these psychological benefits of using wellness questionnaires to understand where the athlete or where the individual is at. So some of the things that they might consider monitoring in these questionnaires include soreness, irritability, stress, sleep, diet quality, and then some examples of some of these questionnaires include the Profile Mood States, or the POMS, and the TMD, or the Total Mood Disturbances. Another study by Kelmet was using a third questionnaire that I want to bring up called the REST Q Sport, and this evaluated recovery stress in different types of athletes. So this one spanned a lot of different varieties of athletes, and they were looking at subjectively measuring general and emotional as well as social stress, conflict, looking at fatigue, looking at lack of energy, looking at complaints, success, social and physical recovery, well-being, sleep quality and sleep disturbance, emotional exhaustion, injury, their ability or their feelings of being in shape, their accomplishments, and their efficacy as well as self-regulation abilities on a scale from 1 to 6. This is a pretty thorough scale, and the authors deemed this as an appropriate tool for elite level athletes. The final study that I bring up in my introduction here is by McGann et al., and it was published as a readiness to train survey in a couple of previous studies. And they used this over the course of a week to determine their Gaelic football players' wellness / readiness to train / preparedness profiles as they were going through a week of vigorous, let's say, strength and conditioning or weight room training. And they were using a 1 to 5 Likert scale for the following questions. What is your mood state? What is your sleep quality? What is your energy level? What is your muscle readiness? How was your previous day's diet? And what is your stress level? And each of the numbers had a corresponding qualitative value that the athletes could look to identify their number. And the authors concluded from this that the use of counter movement jumps, readiness to train surveys as they call them, and rate of perceived exertions as well as GPS monitoring was suitable for athletes, and that we could find a correlation between these readiness to train surveys and some of the objective data that they're collecting. So my takeaway from these 3 studies was that it's a possibility that we can apply these wellness questionnaires to physical education students on a daily basis if they were brief and they were understandable enough for this age group. But before I get started there, I really want to identify that word preparedness that I used with an operational definition, because I've already mentioned a couple of things and this is starting to get muddy. We mentioned wellness, readiness to train, and preparedness, but we're going to take that and siphon that all down into one thing. I'm specifically looking at preparedness with this study. And so my survey is going to be brief. So what is preparedness? Well, preparedness is the state of being prepared or the quality of being prepared. And that's from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Now let's look at that original article that I mentioned, the Hooper et al. Preparedness was listed by several characteristics such as the monitoring of recovery, overtraining, mood, fatigue, stress, irritability, diet, and sleep. Now if we think about all of those little factors, we don't need to measure every single one, but all of them can have some type of positive or negative influence on each of these physical education students as they come to class. They may be in a great mood, they may be in a poor mood, and it's hard to identify most of them if you have a very large classroom or you're in a subject that doesn't allow for a lot of that personal one-on-one time to determine if the kids are prepared for a specific workout. Now, again, if we go back to what our 3rd standard was for the model content standards for California, they're informing us that we need to teach these students to associate psychological and sociological concepts with physical activity. So the use of these surveys can very well serve to fill that need. So I just want to mention a brief section here on some of the major gaps now that we know where this project is going. So some of the major gaps include using preparedness surveys in not only young adults, but underaged athletes and non-athletes. Another one would be the use of experimental studies. A third limitation might be producing longitudinal studies in this specific age group and population. And then finally, just a general overview of these limitations really is rooted in the fact that wellness surveys are not necessarily used in physical education, even though that really could fulfill that 3rd standard. So what is the problem with this? At the center of this, the main problem is that we need to be using preparedness scales each day, maybe not even just in physical education students, but with this age group of students who could have a fluctuation of things like mood, diet, sleep on a daily basis to understand how they're going to be performing in our physical education classes. So the purpose is going to be to analyze the scales association with some performance tests that we typically use in physical education, like the broad jump and the aerobic capacity test. So the hypothesis for our experiment is going to be that the individual predictive points in the scale, sleep quality, mood quality, diet quality, energy level, soreness level, and stress level, will correlate with a broad jump and with the aerobic capacity test. So let's move on to the literature review. So our literature review has 4 sections. The initial section is titled Physical Education in Adolescence. And so one of the things I want to do is briefly touch on the standards that we mentioned in the introduction and then expand on them a little bit. So our physical education content standards were published in the state of California for kindergarten through 12th grade. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on the 9th through 12th grade standards, but we need to understand that these standards were put in place to help students transition from childhood to adulthood and know the necessary things to be able to lead an active lifestyle once they are exiting school. The standards are provided by the state as a means for respecting the local control for schools. And it's not only to facilitate quality physical education, but to support the teachers in the instruction and development of a good program. So our 3 standards are: the students demonstrate knowledge of and competency in motor skills, movement patterns, and strategies needed to perform a variety of physical activities. Students achieve a level of physical fitness for health and performance while demonstrating a knowledge of fitness concepts, principles, and strategies. And students will demonstrate a knowledge of psychological and sociological concepts, principles, and strategies that apply to learning and the performance of physical activity. These are designed to illustrate an 8-year progression from the beginning of kindergarten to the end of high school. And it's created to assist kids in managing family obligations, as well as occupational assignments and individual choices while they continue to manage physical activity and healthy lifestyle during as well as after their high school career. So our second section was titled Adolescents and Their Abilities to Perceive Wellness, and the study that I want to highlight there is by Rachel et al. In 2013, which evaluated the definition of wellness and various scales associated with psychometric measurements to determine if the two could potentially be correlated. So in this study, the authors discussed various definitions, including the WHO's definition, which stated that the relationship between optimal achievement in multiple domains and optimal contribution in multiple life settings to convene at the optimal level of health and wellness. So multiple scales were identified within this study with their individual definitions of wellness, including the evaluation of lifestyle, the 5-factor wellness inventory, the perceived wellness survey, the life assessment questionnaire, the test well, the optimal living profile, the wellness inventory, the holistic wellness assessment, the adolescent wellness appraisal, the juvenile health and wellness survey, the perceived wellness profile, and then finally the last scale was the wellness factor of Laffery Health Conception Scale. Now, the authors discussed the major shortcomings of wellness scales, including the scarcity of validity and reliability of scales in our specific population, adolescents, as well as they discussed the construct validity of scales based on foundational definitions. Then minimal to no psychometric testing in adolescents was identified. And then probably the most important part was they discovered there was a need for a gold standard for the definition of wellness, including the physical, the psychological, and the social well-being, with and without the absence of illness for which to compare the scale's validity to. So the authors in this study, Rochelle 2013, they concluded that there were several needs not limited to a gold standard definition for wellness, also more validity and reliability studies in the variety of groups for wellness scales, and then they also determined that further research needed to be performed in adolescent populations in order to validate these wellness scales. Our third section was titled Objective Wellness and Performance, and the study I wanted to highlight from that section is the Dietz-Hermosa study, which was performed in 2021, and it investigated a relationship between jumping movements or jumping tests as well as sprint performances or running performances. So they took about 25 athletes in this study and they performed 3 jump assessments and then 2 different 30-meter sprint tests. One was a flying 30 where they took the middle of it, and then one was an accelerated 30 where they took the beginning and they tested it all the way to the end. The data was presented as means, standard deviations, and range, and then a Pearson-R correlation was used to compare the jumps with the sprint assessment and the sprint profile components, including the speed, the velocity, the force, and the power of each of those jumps and sprint events. The researchers also used a stepwise regression to explain the variance from each jumping exercise pertaining to the sprint profile components. The variables for the jumpers were entered into the regression, including distance, velocity, force for each of the jump assessments, and then a moderate to large association was found for all 3 of the jumps and the sprint assessment times. So correlations were also found between the 3 different jump assessments and all the components of the sprint profile, the 2 different sprints, as well as the velocity, the force applied, and the distance of the sprints. Finally, the authors discovered that the broad jump was the best predictor of the sprint profile components during both sprint tasks compared to the 2 other jumping tests. And then they further concluded that this probably occurred because of the rapid generation of force and the similarities of the direction of force between the 2 tasks, running a horizontal sprint and then performing a horizontal jump. The third section of our literature review is titled Wellness, Perception, and Performance. And we're going to go ahead and bring it back to what we talked about in the introduction section. I do want to mention this study again. This was kind of the highlight of this section, the McGann et al. 2019 study, which looked at training Gaelic football players over the course of a week in the weight room, and then using a couple objective as well as psychometric tests to determine the appropriate training loads. So it illustrated the relationship of training loads and readiness to train during a pre-competition training camp in Gaelic football players. 30 of these players were evaluated for total distance and high-speed running through GPS, as well as counter-movement jumps and readiness to train through the psychometric questionnaire, which is the similar questionnaire that we're going to be using in this study. So no significant differences were measured, but a trend was identified illustrating a lower readiness to train score out of those 6 questions in individuals that were registering more high-speed running in a match or in a practice compared to individuals that registered less high-speed running. So this study established that there was a relationship between mileage in a practice or mileage in a match, and then high-speed running, as well as rate of perceived exertion and readiness to train. So we kind of saw a lot of things line up with this readiness to train survey with a lot of the objective data. So now that we kind of have a flow of where we're going with this study, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the methodology. So our participants are going to be high school aged physical education students. We're looking to administer a survey to approximately 700 subjects. And we're going to do this by recruiting through email because we need to reach out to the parents first and determine if the parents are okay with their students participating in this specific experiment. And the reason is we're going to be performing this experiment during school hours during each individual period of the students that choose to participate. There are 3 distinct physical education classes, so just to give you an idea of the variety of student that we are seeing, there will be Physical Education 1 students, so students in their freshman year of PE, Physical Education 2 students, which could be students anywhere from 10th grade to 12th grade because it's their second year of PE, and then we will also have Physical Education weight training and fitness students, so students that are in a PE3 course. They might either be in 10th, 11th, or 12th grade, similar to PE2, but the bulk of their curriculum takes place in a strength training or a resistance training modality. So what types of instruments are we going to be administering during this experiment? We're going to use a demographics questionnaire so we can get some accuracy in the demographics, including age, grade, what course they are in, race and ethnicity, sex, physical activity level, and then a grade point average on a 4-point scale. We're going to use the psychometric scale that we've mentioned a couple times from the McGann et al. Study. This is a 5-point Likert scale, and there are multiple topics including sleep, diet, stress, mood, muscle soreness, and then finally energy. And the rankings for 1 go from very bad, 3 is not much difference at all, and then 5 is going to be very good. Then there is the broad jump test, which is the test to give us a measurement of full body power, number 1, but it's also a test that we've looked at a couple of the studies in the literature review that shows an ability to be an objective test for preparedness. We see this in a couple different studies like the Ab-Rahman study in 2021 and the Mulder study in 2005. And then we have the aerobic capacity test, which for this specific age group is the 20-meter beep test, or also termed the 20-meter pacer test here in America. This test is fairly simple. It involves the use of a basketball court, lining the kids up on the sideline, and then a speaker to play the beep test through, and then the students just have to follow along with the beep. And other than that, the administrator is going to monitor how far they make it, how many laps they completed. And then you can achieve 2 things. You can achieve a total time as well as the highest speed, which are 2 good correlators with VO2 max, and that's how it gives us an aerobic capacity. So how is this going to be administered? Let's look at the procedures here for a second. Let's go back to what we talked about with recruiting and consent. Prior to recruiting the individuals, we're going to get permission from the administration at the high school, and then we're also going to get permission from the parents. Then we're going to market the study through email to the students as well as the parents, and then from there I will also make my way into the other 2 PE teachers' classrooms to market for the project. Then once we get the volunteers, comes the introduction and familiarization as well as testing. So the subjects are going to take part in this during their physical education class. So essentially what will happen is the students who choose to participate will come with me, the main researcher. The other students will go with the other 2 PE teachers and take part in the traditional PE curriculum for the day that we'll be doing the experiment. The students will start by filling out a pre-participation questionnaire to determine if they're cleared to participate in the study. Then they will do the demographics to just get some basic information about them. Upon completion of the initial data, we're going to have a general warm-up consisting of 5 minutes of walking and jogging, and then a more specific warm-up, some dynamic movements such as lunges, quad pulls, figure 4 hip lifts, knee to chests, lateral lunges, forward and backward skips, shuffles, cariokas, and then back pedals and sprints just to get them prepared for the jumping and running tasks. Then the students will be given some basic direction about how to fill out the scale. The scale is going to be filled out using a Google form, and the students will be filling out the forms on their piece of technology of choice, such as an iPhone, an Android phone, or a Chromebook. Each student has a Chromebook. And they'll receive information such as definitions of sleep, nutrition, stress, mood, energy level, and soreness. I will also be going over the definitions of a 1 rating, 2, 3, 4, and a 5 rating for each of those individual categories. And then we'll talk a little bit about their subjective perception of these categories. And then we will give them the survey, and they will administer their first set of answers for the survey. Now, following this, we'll go do a walkthrough of the physical testing, which includes the broad jump as well as the aerobic capacity test. And then after that, the students will be instructed to go through the broad jump test first, and then they will go through the aerobic capacity test following the broad jump test. So here's some of the ideas for what we're going to be doing with the design of the project and the data analysis. So the project is designed to analyze a correlation between the preparedness scale components as well as the broad jump and the aerobic capacity test, and this will be done in high school adolescent physical education students. The data is going to be collected in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet after all of the students have completed the surveys in Google Forms. There's an option to download it into a spreadsheet. The descriptive stats will be compiled to capture critical participant characteristics. We will probably be looking at some univariate and multivariate analysis of variance with the psychometric scale components: sleep, diet, stress, mood, muscle soreness, energy, and broad jump as independent variables. And then the aerobic capacity test as a dependent measure. Pearson product moment correlation analyses will be conducted to identify the participants' psychometric scores and if they are correlates related to the broad jump and the aerobic capacity tests. And all of these statistical analyses will be completed using SPSS with an alpha of p is less than or equal to 0.05. The values will be expressed as means and standard deviations. Also, there are some ethical considerations. So to best meet the needs of the subjects, we're going to put some of these in place. These include an approval from the Institutional Review Board, Human Subjects Review Committee through the Concordia University of St. Paul. The pre-participation forms and consent forms are going to be filed to ensure healthy subjects as well as the subjects volunteering for this project. And these forms will be collected electronically. Once they're filed, they will be stored in a locked folder, and that will only be accessible by the researcher. There's going to be no monetary or grade point related reward for this subject or for participation in this subject, in this experiment. And then furthermore, data will be de-identified once it comes to the analysis phase. So thank you all for listening. I think this is going to be a successful project, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. And I also look forward to following through with it. Thank you. Have a great evening.